Okay, hi everybody. Thank you for coming. And Chodesh Tov, we're rapidly approaching the great Yom Tov of Purim, happiest day of the year. And after that is Pesach, which is also supposed to be a very happy time, although some people get a little anxious over it. And we do have a lot of dedications for today. First, a Mazel Tov, congratulations to Rabbi Poston and family on the birth this week of a baby boy, grandson. And Bezras Hashem, the baby should grow up in Torah, Chuppah, and Masim Tovim, and the bris should be on time. And Baruch Hashem is part of the Yiboneh family, another member of the family. In addition, Aliyat Neshama for Yisrael ben Yosef Yehuda, the father of Sara Yocheved Rigler, as well as the father of Viola Lubik, Daniel ben Yisrael Umichal. That yahrzeit is on the 7th of Adar. We hope that the Divrei Torah should be Le'iloi Nishmatam. A Refua Shelema for Yecheskail Abraham HaLevi ben Esther and Chaim David ben Gitele. Again, may they have a Refua B'soch Kol Cholei Yisroel. Then we go on, and the following special dedication by Rena and Mark Kwestel for the entire month of Adar in appreciation of this year, as a zechus for Refuah Shlaimuh for all of Cholei Yisroel, and that Chodesh Adar should be filled with Simcha for all of Am Yisroel. Again, it's something to really think about, because unfortunately, as all of us are aware, there have been a number of tragedies and terrorist incidents, and I myself am from West Hartford, Connecticut. I did not know the young man that tragically died in terrorism, but in fact, it's from my hometown. He davened in my parents' shul, and he also was a Talmid of Or Samech many years ago, before I was there. So in some strange way, I have a lot of connection with him. And what a tragedy it is, and along with all the other tragedies, the Pele boys that were brutally killed. So we hope indeed that the month of Adar should be filled with Simcha and Yeshua. In addition, Yiboneh has started its Matanot Le'Evyonim for Purim, as well as Kimcha de Pischa, which is providing help for people for Pesach, fundraising campaign. And you can talk to Rabbi Poston about how to do this, how to contribute. And there's a link that can be found in the YouTube description box, as well as the Yiboneh website. Let's see if I'm missing anything. One more thing here. Okay. Registration for the Pesach Seder has already begun. And you can find the information on the Yiboneh website. Mr. Hashem, I hope to be mishtatef in the Seder. Okay, so a lot of announcements, but Yosef Hashem, they're all good announcements. So I want to talk a little bit about the holiday of Purim, even though that means we're not going to fully cover the Parsha of Tetzaveh. I will tell you one little short vort about Parshat Tetzaveh. Parshat Truma discussed the Mishkan. Parshat Tetzaveh is continuing that, but it focuses primarily on the priestly garments, on the Big Day Kahuna. Now, that's a very important thing. If a Kohen is not, right, they say clothes makes the man. In the case of Big Day Kahuna, it is 100% the case. Because if a Kohen were to do the service in the temple, or the Mishkan, without wearing the proper uniform, not only is that a sin, but the entire temple service is invalid. So it's a very important thing. The Big Day Kahuna are a very, very major part of the service, and that is what Parshat Tetzaveh is all about. But it is the only Parsha in the Torah since the birth of Moshe where Moshe's name is not mentioned. Obviously, in the Parshios of Bereshis, where Moshe wasn't born yet, his name is not mentioned. But once Moshe was born in Parshat Shemot, every single Parsha of the Torah mentions Moshe Rabbeinu, except for Parshat Tetzaveh. And there's a famous observation, I'm sure you may have heard it, from the Vilna Gaon, that basically says that Parshat Tetzaveh is, at least in a non-leap year, is always read the week of the 7th of Adar. And the 7th of Adar is indeed the yard site, the day that Moshe Rabbeinu died, although he was also born. So to kind of allude to the fact that this is the week of his absence, Moshe Rabbeinu's name is not mentioned. Also, it is treated as a fulfillment of the curse that Moshe gave himself. After the sin of the golden calf, which we're going to read about next week, so Hashem said to Moshe, let's make a private deal. Let me eradicate the Jewish people. I will make a covenant with you. Right? So I'll make a private deal with you, Moshe. And Moshe turned it down. Moshe turned Hashem down. Moshe said, you either forgive the people and we're all together, or not, erase me from your book. Now it's brought down that even though Moshe's curse was conditional, erase me if you don't forgive the people, but it wasn't proper for him to talk that way. So in a sense, Hashem says, you're going to get some of your medicine and you will be partially erased from the Torah. And that partial erasure was indeed in Parshat Tetzaveh. So that's an interesting observation about Parshat Tetzaveh. I will also leave you with a question which I'm not even going to answer at all, but it's something to think about. If you look at Truma and Tetzaveh, the division is normally a very neat division. Truma is Mishkan, Tetzaveh is Big Day Kahuna. And that fits 98% of the content of the two Parshias. But here is the thing. We read all about the Mishkan in Truma. And then we read about the Big Day Kahuna in Tetzaveh. And at the very end of Tetzaveh, we are given the instructions about the golden altar. Remember, there are two altars in the Mishkan and in the Beis HaMikdash. There is the outer altar in the courtyard, which was big, and you brought all the korbanos. But then in the temple building itself, or the Mishkan building itself, there was a much smaller golden altar called Mizbeach HaZahav, and that was not used for korbanos. Only on Yom Kippur, some of the blood was sprinkled, but generally speaking, on the inner altar you brought ketores. Now, the inner altar is described in Tetzaveh after all the Big Day Kahuna. It is actually out of place. In Truma, we talked about the Aron, and the Shulchan, and the menorah, and the outer altar. It would have been quite logical to talk about the golden altar at that point. So, question for thought, question for discussion. I'm not going to answer it because my shir is not about that. Why is the discussion of the Mizbeach HaZahav deferred until after all of the Big Day Kahuna? That actually is a difficult interpretive question. Okay, so I don't only give you answers, I try to give you questions that you can think about or research or look into. But as I say, the main thing I want to talk about this week is the holiday of Purim. And if you think about, like, what are we celebrating on Purim? We're actually celebrating two different things. You might call it a positive aspect and a negative aspect. The positive aspect is that Baruch Hashem, we almost were destroyed. We were in danger of being wiped out. And God saved us. There's a Yeshua. There is a salvation that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, at the last minute, so to speak, gave us the ability to be saved from our enemies. That's the positive celebration of Purim, the Yeshua Gedola. But there's also a negative. It is actually a celebration of the downfall and destruction of the evil of Amalek. We are celebrating not only the fact that we're saved, we are also celebrating the Mapala of Haman. Now Haman, remember, was from Amalek. Remember the way all of this works. Shaul HaMelech was the very first king of the Jewish people. And Shaul happened to be from the tribe of Binyamin. And we're going to read, in fact, we're going to read the Haftorah of this week, is going to be that Haftorah. And he was commanded, as the Torah commands us, but he was given a specific command. It is now time to eradicate Amalek. And Shaul did a great job. He did 99% of the job. But Shaul spared two things. He spared the king of Amalek, and he also spared a lot of the sheep. And the Navi Shmuel comes to Shaul and says to Shaul, why didn't you do the will of God? And Shaul says, I did the will of God. I eradicated Amalek. And Hashem says, why do I hear the bleating of the sheep? And Shaul says, well, I was afraid of the people. The people want to bring it for korbanos, etc. In fact, it's brought down. The Sefer Chaim, Rabbi Yosef Alba, says a very, very interesting idea. Shaul sinned in failing to carry out the Amalek mitzvah, and one strike and he's out. God says, you are no longer going to be king. David sinned with Bathsheba, which one could argue was a worse sin. And although David suffered, that was responsible for Avshalom trying to kill him, his own son, and the baby that he had with Bathsheba died. But at the end of the day, David remains Melech. So Rabbi Yosef Albo asks the Kasha, why is Shaul not given a second chance? And David is given a second chance. What's the difference? So he actually gives two answers. Both answers are very, very interesting. Answer one is that Shaul's sin was a failure to carry out the duties of his position. He was a melech. A melech had a chiyuv to eradicate Amalek. He failed to fulfill his obligation. David's sin was a sin, a personal sin, a Yetzer Hara sin. But it was not malfeasance in the performance of his office. So even a personal sin, if you do tshuva, God will allow you to keep your position. But malfeasance in office is grounds for removal. Now, this is actually very, very fascinating. Yosef Albo lived, I think, in the 1300s. And this is actually a major debate in American constitutional law. This was relevant to Bill Clinton, if you remember years ago, where Bill Clinton had various affairs and the like. So the question is that grounds for impeachment? Can a president be removed because he cheats on his wife? Big machlokas. Some constitutional scholars said, hey, that's a personal moral failure. That has nothing to do with his conduct as president. Others say, if a person has bad moral character, that taints everything. Rav Yosef Alba was actually suggesting in this first answer that the only grounds for the removal of a melech is his failure to fulfill the duties of a melech. And a personal moral failure is between him and God, but God will allow him to keep his position. Very fascinating. Mamish has political repercussions. But then Rav Yosef Alba gives a second answer, which I think is even more powerful. He says the difference between Shaul and David is not the magnitude of their sin. Maybe David's sin is worse than Shaul's sin, but it's how they respond when the Navi identifies their sin. You'll notice that the first thing Shaul did was deny that he sinned at all. He said, I did what Hashem said. And when Shmuel says, how come I hear the sheep and Agag is here? So Shaul can no longer deny his sin, but he offers excuses. He shifts the blame. He blames others. The people made me do it. He didn't take responsibility for what happened. And Shmuel gave him Musar on that. Shmuel said, you're humble, you're modest, you think you're nobody. Okay, Shaul at one point was very, very modest and humble. But you are the leader. And as the leader, you must take charge. You can't allow yourself to be controlled by people and the like. And indeed, and I'll come back to the fact that Shaul apparently changed in the opposite direction. We'll get to that in a moment. Now, when David committed the sin with Bathsheba, now it's true that Chazal say that technically David may not have sinned in as gross a way as we might imagine. It says every soldier who went to war gave his wife a get, and therefore David actually lived with an unmarried woman. So it was not technically adultery. And the Gemara even has a lashon that anyone that said that David sinned is making a mistake. But I'm going to tell you an opposite statement. Anyone who says David didn't sin is also making a mistake. Because it's impossible to simply say, David did nothing wrong. The Navi Shmuel, the book of Shmuel says, Beferish, he did something awful. So we have to understand the idea that even if David technically did not commit an offense, spiritually in God's book, he was guilty of adultery because the expectation was that the soldier would remarry his wife, and he was guilty of murder because he didn't kill Uriah, but he sent him to the front He positioned him to be killed, and as the Navi said, it was you that killed him with the sword of the Ammonite. Maybe it was an Ammonite army, Ammon, that killed him, but you were the one that killed him, right? So we have to be careful sometimes. I see sometimes in the yeshiva world, they say, how can you say David did anything wrong? Well, the book of Shmuel says David did something really wrong. So Chazal are not whitewashing. Chazal are telling us the other way around, that even though David was technically okay, being in technical compliance is not enough. Sometimes they say in Washington, D.C., that the standard of ethical behavior is you did a non-indictable offense, meaning to say, if what you did won't get you indicted, okay, that's called morality. Well, the book of Shmuel is telling us exactly the opposite. Yeah, David had all his cards in order. No Aveira at all. And yet. So, Nasan Hanavi, Shmuel, it's in the book of Shmuel, but Shmuel is not alive anymore. So the prophet who comes to David is Nasan Hanavi. And Nasan Hanavi says to the king, I want to ask you a question. There were two men, a rich man and a poor man, and the rich man had so many sheep. And the poor man had one little sheep, and the rich man was making a party, and the rich man took the sheep of the poor man, which is all he had in the world, and he slaughtered it and gave it to the guests. What do you think should happen to such a guy? And David is outraged at the selfishness, at the egotism, at the lack of compassion, the lack of caring. And he says, such a man deserves to die. Now, of course, halakhically, actually, he doesn't deserve to die. I mean, at worst, he did that. But David is saying, morally, such a man doesn't even deserve to live. So Nasan Hanavi then says, you are that person. You did exactly that. And David only said two words. Chatasi Lashem. I sinned. Now, the thing is, David actually had excuses. He had all the excuses the Chachamim give him. David could have said, she had a get. What do you mean? David could have said, I had a right to send a soldier to the front. The Gemara even says that. He had the right to send Uriah there. David had the excuses. But David didn't use them because he knew that his heart at that moment was not pure. So Rav Yosef Albo says the difference why Shaul does not get a second chance and David gets a second chance is not because Shaul's sin is worse than David's sin, but rather David takes responsibility for his action. He doesn't try to deny it. He doesn't try to defend himself. And Shaul equivocates. Denial, defense. And that a leader cannot do. Meaning leaders can make mistakes. Leaders make mistakes. Happens all the time. But a leader takes the achrayus for a mistake. And then Hashem says that could be allowed to go on. Like Harry Truman used to say, the buck stops here. And whether you're a Rosh Hashiva, a Gadol, a politician, in theory, one should take responsibility for the decisions that were made. Now, going back to the Purim story. Agag, the king of Amalek, Shaul spared because he had rachamim on Agag. I guess kings like kings. Shmuel is the actual person who finished Agag off. But in the relatively brief time, we don't know, between the time Agag was apprehended and Agag was killed, Agag managed to impregnate somebody, and that was the ancestor of Haman. That's why he's called Haman Ha'agagi. Haman, who comes from Agag. So, what do you see from here? Shaul had mercy on Amalek. Now that looks like something merciful. Out of that mercy came an enemy who was on the verge of destroying the entire Jewish people. In fact, the Gemara tells us we were worthy of being destroyed, meaning it was not a done deal that Haman wouldn't be successful. Haman could have been successful. So, what do you see from here? As the Gemara says, when you have mercy on Amalek, you can't imagine the consequences that might ensue. And indeed, the Gemara makes the point, Kol HaMerachem al ha'achzar. He who has mercy on those who are cruel, sofo lehitachzor, he will have cruelty to those who deserve mercy. The same Shaul, who was so motivated out of compassion that he couldn't kill the king of Amalek, when later David gets shelter and refuge in Nov, a village near Yerushalayim where there were many Kohanim who lived, what did Shaul do? Shaul massacred the city through Doeg, his advisor. He massacred the city of Nov, Ira Kohanim. Where did the Rachamim go? Right? If you have misplaced mercy, you'll have misplaced cruelty. That's exactly what happened here. Now, but there is a poetic symmetry, because Shaul is from the tribe of Binyamin, and he failed to kill Agag. And that resulted in Haman, who had a gezerah against all of the Jewish people. But who engineered the downfall of Haman? Mordechai and Esther. Mordechai and Esther are from Shaul. They are from the tribe of Binyamin. So Mordechai and Esther against Haman were able to be misakein, able to rectify what Shaul failed to do. It's very, very important to understand that, in a sense, the descendant of Shaul was able to destroy the descendant of Agag, the king of Amalek. There is a short story, I think I mentioned it before, from Roald Dahl, if that's how you pronounce it, the D-A-H-L, famous British writer. I don't know if he's still alive. Willy Wonka, Chocolate Factory, Roald Dahl. But he wrote children's stories, but one of his stories was an interesting thought experiment about a doctor who gets summoned in Germany to a house, and in the middle of the night, because a baby has whooping cough and a baby seems to be on the verge of death. And a mother begs and begs and begs, this is my life, this is my child, this is the most precious thing. And the baby's like beautiful but suffering so much. And the doctor's heart is filled with compassion. He wants to help the baby, help the mother. So let's imagine, everything sounds so important and wonderful and good. Let's imagine at that moment you were given prophetic clarity, and that baby you knew would grow up to be Adolf Hitler. That would kill, 6 million Jews and actually millions of other people as well. What's the merciful... Now we can't make judgments like that because we don't know. I mean, this is a theoretical question. But what would the merciful... What is true Rachmanus at that point? Is the true Rachmanus to heal Adolf Hitler? Knowing, again, we never know, but this is a theoretical, knowing that he'll grow up and kill 6 million people? Or what would the truly merciful thing to do is give him a lethal injection so there'll be no Hitler in the world? Now, this is a hard one, right? It's totally theoretical, but if we were faced with such a situation, you're going to kill a suffering baby in front of his mother? Right? That sounds horrendous. And yet, you're going to save 6 million people. Now, it is impossible for a human being to make such a judgment. Impossible. So we don't make that judgment. But there's one entity that can make that judgment, and that's God. So when God gives us a command to kill Amalek, and people say, that's so inhumane, God knows that the Amaleks are going to be Hitlers. And God is telling you, kill the Hitlers before they become Hitlers. Now again, I want to be very, very explicit. Sometimes people use this rhetoric to justify, killing children of terrorists or whatever it is. We can't do that. We can't make predictions. The child of a terrorist might grow up to be the tzaddik of the world or whatever it is. We can't extrapolate beyond the divine command. So I'm not saying we should use Amalek as a prototype for anything. We should not. But within the specifics of the command, where God himself is giving you the judgment, that's exactly what is going on. So the point is that Purim has a double aspect to it. Purim is the joy of being saved, the joy of God redeeming us, but it's also the joy of the downfall of Amalek and the tikkun, the rectification of the mistake that Shaul made. Now, it's very, very interesting that this even has halachic ramifications. I don't want to get into it too much. You know that normally a mitzvah that is a time-bound positive commandment, like tzitzis or tefillin, women are exempt from. But one of the exceptions to that rule, there are many exceptions actually, is reading Megillah or hearing Megillah. Every woman as well as man is obligated to hear the Megillah on Purim. And the reason is because they too were beneficiaries of the miracle. So some have argued the following. Some have argued that since men and women are equal in obligation, there's nothing wrong with a woman reading Megillah to a man. Now, to do it publicly would be a kol isha problem, but let's say husband and wife. If the husband has laryngitis or whatever, or the wife happens to know how to read the Megillah better than her husband, which, by the way, is entirely possible today, so some poskim say, why can't a woman read Megillah for a man? She has the same obligation as a man. But Tosfos brings a shita of the Baal Hilchos Gedolos, the Bahag, one of the early Gaonim, that says that even though a woman is obligated to read Megillah, she cannot read it for a man. And the question is, why not? I mean, normally, when men and women have the same obligation, Kiddush is a good example. A woman can 100% make Kiddush for her husband. Because Lagabe Kiddush, men and women are equal. That's another exception. So, if a woman could make Kiddush for her husband, why can't a woman read Megillah for her husband? What's the understanding of the Bahag? So in Lumdus, in analytical theory, they explain it this way. In reading Megillah, we are celebrating two ideas. We are celebrating redemption, salvation, and we are celebrating the eradication of Amalek. So some have suggested, since the eradication of Amalek is connected to war, women are always exempt from combat. So therefore, a woman is not obligated in the eradication of Amalek. So it turns out, when a man reads Megillah, a man is commemorating two ideas. The woman is only commemorating one idea, that of the miracle, and therefore a woman cannot be motzi a man because she does not have the same obligation as the man. Of course, according to that, you can raise a very good question. So why do women go to shul, Parshat Tetzaveh, hear about Amalek? The Sefer HaChinuch actually says a woman is exempt from Parshat Tetzaveh because they're not involved in war. So the Baal Hilchos Gedolos could very well follow the Sefer HaChinuch Shita. We're machmir, that we tell women to go, but the truth is, in Europe, it was not that common. I mean, now, Parshat Tetzaveh is the big thing. Everyone has to go to Parshat Tetzaveh. In Europe, it was not necessarily that common, because many Rishonim say women are exempt from Parshat Tetzaveh, because remembering Amalek is connected to waging war against Amalek, and women are not involved in the war. So, here's the thing about Amalek I want to share with you. If indeed Purim is not just a celebration of salvation, but is a celebration of the downfall of Amalek, there's a very important yesod that one has to understand. And that is, the power of Amalek over us depends on having a certain aspect of Amalek within us. Meaning, there's an Amalek within that gives power to the Amalek without. And therefore, when the Torah says eradicate Amalek, it's not only referring to eradicating the Amalek outside of you, but it may refer even more to eradicating the Amalek inside of you. I think there's a movie series or something about, I think, Nightmare on Elm Street, and I've never seen it, I promise you. But the conceit, I read an article, the conceit of the movie is that somehow the nightmares you have in your mind can become the reality of what you face in the world. And you change your nightmares, or you get rid of your nightmares, you change your reality. Well, this resonates actually with this idea of Amalek. What gives Amalek power is the negative attributes of Amalek that are within me. And as I eradicate the negative part of Amalek within me, the Amalek out there vanishes. It loses its power. It becomes an illusion. It becomes nothing at all. So, therefore, since Purim celebrates the eradication of Amalek, we are thinking about the inner Amalek. Now, what is the inner Amalek that drags us down and makes us vulnerable? So in truth, there are two ideas. Remember that Amalek initially attacked, actually Amalek in the Midbar attacked us twice. The first year we left Mitzrayim, and the 40th year, the last year of the desert, when Aaron died. The first time Amalek attacked us was in the oasis of Rephidim. This is before Har Sinai. Chazal tell us that the word Rephidim, although it's a name of an oasis, is also a contraction of two words, Rafu Yadayim, weak hands. That means complacency. Rafu Yadayim, they didn't care about the Torah. So the Achilles heel that made us vulnerable to Amalek was a lack of passion with respect to the mitzvahs of Hashem. Meaning, you can have a person who keeps everything. I keep the mitzvahs, but I do so without a geschmack. I do so without a passion. I do so on automatic pilot, or maybe I do so with resentment. No, it's a bother. That's called coldness of the heart. And the coldness of the heart makes you vulnerable to Amalek. That's why it says, Asher korcha baderech. They encountered you in the way. So Rashi says, korcha, which means encounter, can also mean made you cold. Now Rashi takes that lashon in a different metaphor. Rashi says, when the Jewish people left Mitzrayim, everybody was scared of them because of the plagues. It was like a boiling hot bath. Amalek jumped into that bath. They got burnt, but they cooled it off for the next guy. That's how Rashi understands it. They made you cold. Rav Tzadok takes the same etymology. Korcha is connected to cold, but he goes a little different. He says that it doesn't refer to the fact that they took away the fear that people had for you, but Amalek represents coldness of the heart. When your heart is cold, Amalek comes in. So the first encounter with Amalek represents coldness of the heart. Now, the next time Amalek attacked us was 40 years later, when Aaron died. And when Aaron died, the clouds of glory that were in the merit of Aaron dispersed. We became exposed. Amalek attacked us. Now, let's see what that really represents symbolically. Symbolically, we know that Aaron's midah was Ohev Shalom V'Rodev Shalom, the lover of peace, the pursuer of peace. Because he was the person who brought shalom, achdus, unity, togetherness, fraternity, love. Aaron brought us the Ananei HaKavod, the clouds of glory that surrounded us and protected us. When Aaron died, a certain aspect of his midah disappeared. Meaning there was less Avas Yisrael. There was less achdus. There was less unity. We didn't deserve the clouds of glory. So that's the second Achilles heel. The lack of unity among Am Yisroel. The sinas chinam. So if you compare the first struggle of Amalek with the second struggle of Amalek, you see the two weaknesses that make us vulnerable to Amalek. You see the coldness of the heart and the lack of enthusiasm. in Avodat Hashem, and you see the sinat chinam and the lack of unity within the Jewish people. And when those two things are present, when either of those things are present, we're vulnerable to Amalek. What's fascinating is, at the time of Purim, now when is Purim? Purim is during the 70 years of the Babylonian exile, but it's towards the end. In fact, the second Beis HaMikdash was built under the reign of Achashverosh's son, from Esther actually, Jewish, Daryavish. So the second Beis HaMikdash is built shortly after the book of Esther, but in the book of Esther itself, there is no Beis HaMikdash yet. But you find in the book of Esther that the Jewish people were guilty of both pigamim at the same time. That's why we were so vulnerable to Amalek, because we had the Amalek within us both times. How is that so? So I'm going to take the second aspect first. If you remember, in the Megillah, when Haman is negotiating with Achashverosh that he wants to destroy this nation, so the Melech says to Haman, Yeshnei Am Echad, there's a certain nation, Mefozer, Meforid Bein Ha'amim, that are scattered among all the nations. Their laws are different than everybody else's. They don't care about the king's laws, etc. And it's not worth the king's time or energy to keep them around. And if the king wants, I'll just eradicate them for you. Now it's Yadua, it's a very well-known idea, that the book of Esther does not contain the name of God. For sure, it's the only book, it is the book that does not contain the name of God. There's a machlokes if Shir HaShirim contains the name of God. That depends on the word shalhavesya, which means a torch, is that one word or two words? If it's shalhavesya, it is just a poetic word for shalhevet. So Hashem's name is not mentioned. If, on the other hand, you read it shalhevet ka, a torch of God, so you do have one mention of God in the Shir HaShirim. Esther for sure does not. Shir HaShirim perhaps does, perhaps does not, depending on shalhavesya. But the Zohar HaKadosh tells us that even though Megillah Esther does not contain the name of God, whenever it says Hamelech, Hamelech refers not only to Achashverosh, but it refers to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Thus, in the dramatic part of the Megillah, when it says, that's the beginning of the change of things, B'layla hahu, that night, Nadada shenas Hamelech, the king could not sleep. So Pashat Pshat is Achashverosh can't sleep. But the Medrash says, it also brings then the pasuk of Tehillim, Lo yanum v'lo yishan shemer Yisrael, the king of Israel, Hashem, does not slumber or sleep. Right? Double meaning. So that means whenever you see Melech, there's simple meaning and higher meaning. Simple meaning is Achashverosh. Higher meaning is Hashem. So, here is the thing. When there's a dialogue between Haman and the Melech, the dialogue is existing on two levels. Lower level is the human prime minister Haman is negotiating with the human king Achashverosh. Higher level is the force of Amalek is arguing with God in Shemayim. So now, let's look at the two perspectives. Haman says to the Melech, there is a nation that is scattered and dispersed. On the lower level, Haman is telling Achashverosh, hey, the Jews are not concentrated, so they don't have the power to fight you. On the higher level, Amalek is saying to God, they don't deserve to be saved because they are divided and separated among themselves. Sinas chinam, lack of achdus, mefozar umeforad bein ha'amim. And that's exactly why. When Mordechai convinces Esther to do something about this, Esther says, Lech kenos es kol Yehudim. Go and gather the Jews for fasting. Because if our weakness is mefozar u'meforad, we have to come together. So that's how you see the pagam of lack of achdus from mefozar u'meforad. Now, where do you see that there was a particular weakness of a lack of passion for keeping the mitzvahs, that the kriras halev, the coldness of the heart, the rafidem and atayra? So this is a bit more subtle. And that is, the Gemara in Megillah discusses why the Jews deserve to be destroyed. What did they do that was so bad? And one of the answers that's given is, because so many Jews enjoyed the party of Achashverosh, and therefore they were chayav misa because they enjoyed the sa'uda. Now, here's the question. What sin did they commit by participating in the seudah? So let's assume they ate non-kosher food. They ate non-kosher wine. That's an aveira, of course, but is that, you're not chayav misa for that. You don't get the death penalty for that. So what is the aveira? They were nanu misudaso shaloso arasha that would make them chayav misa. So here's what the Sfas Emes says. It doesn't say they're getting punished because they ate from the Suda. It doesn't say they're getting punished because they drank at the Suda. They're getting punished because they enjoyed the Suda. Now, what's the problem? Achashverosh made his party the third year of his reign for a particular reason. Yirmiyahu Hanavi had said that the Jews would be in exile for 70 years. Achashverosh miscalculated. He started counting from a wrong point. It's quite a complicated discussion. But he made a calculation that the 70 years were over. He was wrong because you're supposed to start counting from a later point. So he took the kalim of the Beis HaMikdash, and what was his party about? His party was about the fact that the Jewish people are never going to be redeemed. They'll never go out of Galus. There won't be a Beis HaMikdash. There won't be a return to Eretz Yisrael. And there were Jews who came who celebrated that. So it's not the question, oh, they ate treif food and they drank treif wine. Yeah, that's an avera, but they wouldn't have been deserving of death. But essentially they're declaring, we don't need a Beis HaMikdash. We don't need Eretz Yisrael. We're fine where we are. That's complacency. That's indifference. That's lack of passion. So, and that's the pshat. They enjoyed the party, meaning they enjoyed what it represented. We don't need it. We don't need this other stuff. We're fine where we are. Shushan has Chinese restaurants, kosher Chinese restaurants, glad kosher, well, we're going to kosher pizzerias, but again, milk or whatever, pizzeria, whatever it is, we have everything. What are you going to get in Eretz Yisrael anyway? Ben and Jerry's you can get, whatever. So, what do you see from all of this? You see from all of this that why did Haman have such a power over us? Because of the Amalek inside of us. There is the Amalek of indifference and complacency. Nanu misudaso shaloso arasha. And then there's the Amalek of mefozar u'mefarad bein ha'amim. And when there's Amalek inside of you, you are vulnerable to the Amalek outside of you. So, when Baruch Hashem accepts our tshuva, and Hashem allows us to be saved, we have to thank Hashem by kind of eradicating those Amaleks within us, so we're no longer vulnerable. So let's look at Purim. Let's look at the halachic observances of Purim. You see, the halachic observances of Purim are designed to eradicate the internal Amalek. Right? Lack of achdus, separation, sinas chinam. This is why Purim, B'dafka, we go out to connect to people. We have mishloach manos. We exchange gifts of food Matanos li'avyonim. Those who are poor, we try to help. That's why it's brought down that specifically you should give sholach manos to somebody that you may not have the best relationship with. Of course, you have to be careful with that, because people might take that as an insult, I give you sholach manos because, you're not really that much of a friend, so I figured I'll give you sholach manos. You have to be careful not to do that in a hurtful way. But you reach out. That's even the minhag of shaliach, right? The minhag of sholach manos is, although you're yotzei certainly, but the minhag is, instead of me giving it directly to you, I get an intermediary, someone else to bring it, because you're involving more people in the process. More people in the process is friendship. Although you got to be careful sometimes. With sholach manos, sometimes what people want to do, I've been guilty myself, is you kind of circulate. Someone gives you sholach manos and you give the same thing to somebody else to repackage it, and then it goes in a circle. So sometimes you wind up getting back the sholach manos that you gave away. It goes around in a circle in that particular way. But whatever it is, it's marbe reyos, creating friendship. And matanos li'avyonim is about caring about people, having compassion, caring about people in need. So that's a tikkun for mefozar u'meforad bein ha'amim. Right? Very, very good. Now, what is the tikkun for the lack of passion, the complacency in ruchnius, in avodas Hashem? So here, there's another aspect of Purim that we often don't focus on, but it's very, very real. Purim is said to be a day of re-accepting Hashem's Torah. It mentions in the Megillah, kiyamu v'kiblu. They fulfilled and they accepted. So the Gemara in Shabbos Darshans, they fulfilled, they re-accepted what they had already accepted. At Mount Sinai, we accepted the Torah. But we accepted the Torah by Hashem holding a mountain over our heads. There was a certain element of coercion in Matan Torah. On Purim, we accepted out of love and gratitude what we had previously accepted out of fear. And that's why, indeed, that's actually the meaning of the Arizal's famous statement that Purim is holier than Yom Kippur, because Yom Kippur in the Torah is called Yom Kippurim, Day of Atonement. But you can also read it Yom Kippurim. Yom Kippur is a day like Purim, which implies actually that Purim is holier than Yom Kippur. Now, if you had to pick 2 days that are most different in the calendar, Purim and Yom Kippur are really, really, really different days. Yom Kippur is fasting, you're in shul all day. Purim is eating, drinking, rejoicing. But the difference is, Yom Kippur is the culmination of the Sinai Kabbalah Torah. Because, we heard the Ten Commandments on Shavuos, but the first luchos were broken on the 17th of Tammuz. So what happened in Yom Kippur? Moshe brings down the second luchos. So Yom Kippur is the culmination of a Kabbalah Torah that occurred by Hashem holding the mountain over our heads. So Yom Kippur is the completion of accepting the Torah out of fear. Purim is accepting the Torah out of love. And since love is greater and higher than fear, that level of holiness, Purim is unique, even greater than Yom Kippur. Now, that's the cure to lack of enthusiasm. When you do something because you have to do it, you're going to get punished. So you'll do it. But you'll do it without enthusiasm. You do it without joy. You'll do as little as you need to get away with it. When you do something out of love, your whole motivation is very, very different. So, you see, Purim is all about rectifying the inner Amalek that drags us down. Our two problems were lack of unity, coldness and complacency in Avodas Hashem. Purim, we thank Hashem by accepting the Torah out of love, which generates enthusiasm, and by Mishloach Manos and Matanos Le'Avyonim, which is all about Achdus and unity, togetherness, and the like. Because how do we thank Hashem for destroying Amalek? By ourselves trying to destroy the Amalek within our own personalities. Okay, so that is the idea of Purim as being connected to the downfall of Amalek. But now let me just briefly talk about the other aspect of Purim that maybe is more familiar to people. Baruch Hashem, we've survived. Baruch Hashem, we're fine. So here we know that one of the most beloved mitzvahs of Purim, at least in some circles, is drinking on Purim. A person must drink on Purim until they don't know the difference between cursed is Haman and blessed is Mordechai. And that's brought down in the Shulchan Aruch, although it's Machlokas Rishono if we paskin this way, and suffice it to say that one has to be very careful about drinking on Purim. The truth of the matter is, the way the Ramah paskins, it just means you drink a little more than you usually drink, and the mitzvah is only at the Purim meal, which is the day of Purim. At the meal, you're sitting at the table. It is not a reference to drinking in the street or drinking at night or whatever it is. And I don't have to give a whole speech that unfortunately over the years there have been tragedies that occurred as a result particularly of teenagers drinking, automobile accidents. So I'm not here at all to advocate any type of heavy drinking on Purim. In our generation it probably is not an appropriate thing because you have to know how to handle your liquor. And I don't just mean physically, but there's a spiritual element of this as well. But nevertheless, it does say a person should reach a level where they cannot tell the difference between cursed is Haman and blessed is Mordechai. What's the particular significance of not telling the difference between them? Like, why is that anything important? So in the introduction to the Nesivos, who was one of the great Achronims, his commentary to Megillas Esther, he offers a very, very nice explanation to not knowing the difference between cursed is Haman and blessed is Mordechai. And he says the following. He says, the Gemara says, if you remember, when Achashverosh took off his ring and he gave it to Haman, that gave Haman the authority to act as the king. So it says, the Hasarat HaTabat, the removal of the ring, did more good for the Jewish people than 48 prophets and 7 prophetesses. That's how many are mentioned in Tanakh. Because what do the prophets say over and over again? Do tshuva, do tshuva, do tshuva, do tshuva. We never listen. But when that ring was transferred to Haman and our lives were in danger, all of a sudden everybody does tshuva. The Hasarat HaTabat did more for the Jewish people than 48 prophets and 7 prophetesses. So this gives us an interesting perspective on Purim. We typically think we're grateful on Purim because God saved us. We're not grateful that we were in trouble. We would have been happier if we wouldn't have been in trouble. But if we're in trouble, Baruch Hashem, we were saved. But in reality, that's not true. We're grateful not only for being saved, we're grateful that Hashem put us in that trouble, because it was that trouble that brought us to a tshuva that we otherwise wouldn't have had. So, the concept is, cursed is Haman refers to the bad part of the story. Our lives were in danger. Baruch Mordechai is the salvation. A person has to reach a level of Simcha that they realize that they're grateful not only for the good part of the story, but even for the so-called bad part of the story. And that's an important lesson in life, because that reminds us that even in the adversities, even in the tragedies of life, there will be a hidden light, a hidden bracha of God that we have to be aware of. And that's how you reach it, with simcha, with joy, to understand the perspective that in reality, even the din is rachamim. And that's the meaning of Shema. Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. Hashem, Yudkei Vavkei, is rachamim. Elokeinu is Elokim, Midas Hadin. Hashem Elokeinu, from our perspective, I sometimes see God's mercy, and I sometimes see God's judgment. But in reality, Hashem Echad, all of it is Hashem's mercy. Mercy itself comes wrapped in different ways. So I want to wish you all a very happy and joyous Purim, and may indeed Purim be a time of Geula and Yeshua, as it was. It's kind of strange that we're kind of still facing almost the same end. Almost 2,000 years ago, we had a government in Persia that wanted to wipe out the Jewish people. In 2023, 5783, we have a government in Iran that wants to wipe out the Jewish people. So, some things don't seem to change much, but in Mitzvah Hashem, we should have a Purim of the same way. So, thank you.